Hi, everyone. I'm just going to begin. We are waiting for our panelist today, but I want to be mindful of everyone's time and how much time we have allotted. So I wanted to just start in by welcoming you to the third part in our series that we've been holding, that the DGCM has been hosting, Who Tells Your Story? Planning Your Legacy and Planning Your Estate. The DGCM, if you've been with us for the last few weeks, is an estate planning consultancy and intellectual property management program that was created by the Dramatists Guild. What that means is that we manage the copyrights that are left to the Guild. We manage the Guild's intellectual property and also the property of its sister organizations. We are a public purpose corporation, so our primary purpose is protection of authorial intent. So while you may have heirs and trustees and agents that may be looking to generate income, we at the DGCM are always looking towards the author's intent when we're making decisions. To that end, when you onboard with us, we have lots and lots of conversations. We have a long form where we ask you to tell us how you want decisions made. The other benefit of the DGCM is, since we're so intertwined with the Guild, is that we can tap into the Guild's council. So we have a committee on the Guild's council that can really act as your proxy for making decisions. So you can always ensure that even when you're not around to be making these decisions for your work, that they are being made by the best and the brightest, or according to the way that you've told us to. And we, of course, try to do that as best that we can. The DGCM is really a wonderful way to give back to the DG who's been there for you, or to one of its sister organizations that has been there for you during your lifetime. It's also a useful option for those who may have heirs that are not so interested in the management side of things. So to that end, we can work with your lawyers to craft a scenario where a stream of income is going to a beneficiary. Up to 49% of the income generated from your copyright would be going to a beneficiary. And we also allow that up to 4 beneficiaries. So we can definitely work to find something that works for you. We also really work to promote the names and the careers of the writers who are with us. And that's one of the reasons we've been talking so much about legacy here. And there he is, Mr. David Saint. We were just transitioning over to talking about, how are you? Thank you for joining us.
I'm fine. Sorry, the link wasn't working for some reason.
Oh no, that's okay. That's okay. We kind of all know that happens at this point. But I was just going to begin talking about legacy. So that brings us to the wonderful David Saint, who, if you don't know at this point, you'll hopefully know quite well after this conversation. Let me just pull up all I have too many documents open. There we go. So David Saint, as you probably all know, is the artistic director at the George Street Playhouse, which is close to my house. So I'm very familiar with his work. And he's been there for about 23 years now. Is that the right number? And has directed many of their main stage productions there. I Love You, You're Perfect Now Change, American Hero, Act of God with Kathleen Turner. He's also directed Manhattan Theater Club, national tours, Long Wharf, McCarter. So he's certainly been around. He's also the creator of the Next Stage Festival of New Plays, which many of you may have looked at, which developed works like Proof and Spitfire Grill. Got their starts there. He's also won a ton of awards: the Alan Schneider Award, Helen Hayes Award, the Los Angeles Critics Drama Award, several Drama League Awards. He's the president of the Lawrence Hatcher Foundation, and he's actually, I think it's pretty cool, working on a podcast now. I don't know if this is a new thing, but it's something that I found. It's new to me. I found it recently, putting it together, which is a podcast discussion about how we put things together in theater. So that's definitely something for all of you to definitely check out. So welcome, David.
Well, thank you. It's good to be here virtually.
Yes. So we're talking, we've been talking a lot about estate planning legacy planning? How do authors preserve their word when they're not here? How do they preserve what they would like for their work? And that has brought us to you, who is the literary executor of the Arthur Laurents estate. Now, for those of you who may not know or may not remember, Arthur Laurents has a huge history with the Guild. He was a council member for many, many years. So as we talk about legacy, it just seems very appropriate that we found our way to you, so we can also remember at this time one of our incredible Guild members. So tell us, I'm curious to know how your relationship with Arthur Laurents began. How did you meet him?
Well, we met through a couple of mutual friends, Elizabeth Wilson, the actress, and then later Anne Mira. I was directing Afterplay, Anne Mira's play, oops, my phone is slipping, at Manhattan Theater Club. And Arthur came to see it, and he really liked it, and came to me afterwards and wrote me a lovely letter about it and said, you know how to direct high comedy, which is rare, so I would love to get to know you further. I said, great. And then we both found ourselves out in Seattle at the Seattle Rep at the same time. And he was working on a workshop of a new play, and I was directing a play. And we were both in rehearsal at the same time. And I ran into him walking down the street, and I said, Arthur Laurents. He said, David Saint. I said, how are you? He said, terrible. Can you have a drink? And I said, sure. And so we went and had a drink. And then that was one of several dinners we had together during that time. And, you know, he was not having a great experience at the time. And we just got to know each other. And then a few months later, I got a call from my agent saying, I just had an unusual call. Arthur Laurents wants you to direct his next new play out at the Bay Street Theater in Sag Harbor. And I said, oh, fantastic. And my agent at the time, who's no longer my agent, said, I'm going to advise you not to do this. And I said, why? And he said, because Arthur has a wicked reputation. He eats directors for breakfast. And so I said, well, you know, I've only gotten to know him socially, and I haven't had that experience, but let me read the script. So I read the script. I loved it. And I said, I have to do it. And he said, okay. And that was the first I directed of his first show. And then I went on to direct 11 shows by Arthur.
And you're still talking, so it means that you managed to not get...
Yes, well, you know, I found you have to be careful in this business to listen very carefully when you hear things about other people, whom it is that's speaking and what is their actual relationship. You know, over the years, I would meet people who would say things about Arthur, and I'd say, oh, what did you work with him on? Oh, I've never worked with him. Mm-hmm. Okay. How do you know this then? Well, it's just what I've heard. You know, gossip in our business is a terrible, terrible thing. And I think you have to be sure that you know the person you're listening to and what are the circumstances. So regardless, I went on and I never had that problem with it. Now, Arthur was very, very honest to a fault. I mean, where he had no censor. So he would say whatever he felt. And I got used to it because he would come to see every show I directed. And we became friends after I directed one of his plays and then another. And he would come to see everything I directed. And I got used to it. The first time he walked up the aisle after the show and said to me, it's terrible. It's a piece of shit. And I thought, oh, okay, let me wipe that off. And I thought, well, why? And then he would continue to talk to me and tell me exactly what he felt was wrong with it. He had a sort of knee-jerk response to things. And yet he was so smart that he would tell you what was wrong with it. And usually it helped me greatly. And, you know, unlike so many people in this business, you wouldn't hear from Arthur what he thought about something and then hear 2 weeks later the opposite from someone else who said, oh, no, that's not what he really felt. Because you always heard what he really felt. And so the times when I directed something, these weren't his shows, other playwrights, And he came down the aisle and said, "It's great. I love it." You really reveled in those moments because you know he meant it so genuinely. So that started our relationship, and I never looked back. And I kept directing show after show of his, many of them at George Street and some of them in other places.
It's fantastic to hear that. How did he ask you to be a literary executor? Because I think for some people maybe that's an awkward conversation,
Yeah.
a difficult one.
Well, I think for most people it probably is, because I think the first and foremost requirement for choosing whom your literary executor will be, if you're doing it while you're still alive, is trust. I think by the point, Arthur talked to me about being his literary executor and about running his foundation, which was named after him and his partner of 52 years, Tom Hatcher. I believe the first foundation named for two gay men. And by that point, I had worked and known him for over 20 years. And I had worked on so many plays of his. So when he said to me out of the blue one day, "Listen, I want you to run things for me when I'm gone. I want you to be the one who protects my legacy, who is the literary executor for all my works, and also to run my foundation, because I'm going to leave most of my money to this foundation." So I was honored at the time. I thought, wow, that's a great responsibility and at first I didn't want to talk about it. I said, "Listen, you're going to be around for quite a while."
Sure,
So,
yeah.
but then as time went on, I would start talking to him and I'd say, "Okay, let's talk more about this, because if I do this, I want to make sure that I do you proud and do what you would like me to do in your name." So we started a lot of conversations. My biggest advice to anyone looking for a literary executor: start the conversation. Start to identify whom it is you would like to be your literary executor and start the conversation. And with regard to advice of whom that should be, I would recommend someone who knows your work intimately, who knows your aesthetic, and who values your aesthetic. And then it's about, so that can either be a director or another writer, an actor, I guess. But you need someone who has the artistic sensibility in their bones so that they know what it is that is important to you. And then the other part of it, the business part, you need help. So Jonathan Loma, who is the head of WME, was Arthur's agent before he died. And he said he wanted Jonathan to run all the business side of it. So to do the contracts and all of that, because you need both things. You need someone who has a great business savvy, and you need someone first who has a great artistic sensibility for the work.
So let's just back up a second, because some of our folks might not really know what you do as a literary executor. So let's just back up to there. So you were sort of tasked with this huge job of managing an incredible catalog, which I think is an honor, but I think is also a little overwhelming. It must have been, at least initially.
It can be. I remember when Arthur died, and it was announced that I would be his executor. I remember Phyllis Newman, who was a great friend of Arthur's and whom he had directed, came up to me and said, "Listen, the catalog I take care of, was, which was not as large as Arthur's. She was taking care of, her late husband's estate. And she said, the first word of advice, I have one word for you: an assistant. She said, you're going to need somebody whom you trust, who can run the day-to-day, because there's so much of it. It can be overwhelming. It is overwhelming if it's a large catalog, as you said. And Arthur's catalog, some people may not know. I mean, people know him obviously from West Side Story and Gypsy, and but and other shows that he wrote, Time of the Cuckoo, and Anyone Can Whistle, and Do I Hear a Waltz. But the fact of the matter is, he has a very large estate that also encompasses film and television.
Right.
Arthur wrote many, many movies, you know, two of which were given many awards, The Turning Point and The Way We Were, in addition to many other films that he wrote in the early days of Hollywood. So basically, his catalog encompasses all the stage work and all the film work and all the TV work. As the literary executor, it is your role to field any inquiries about these properties. People want to do a revival of any of the shows. If it's a major revival, which means Broadway, West End, national tour, a world tour, those productions have to be approved by the literary executor. And by approved, I mean not just the set of circumstances, who's producing, where it's going to be done, who's directing, and also in the case of, for instance, West Side Story, who's playing the leads. In the case of Gypsy, who's playing the leads. Those all need approval by the literary executor. Now, in those particular two cases, which I'll take because they're so well known, Gypsy and West Side Story, and generate still the most income from royalties to this day, that those two properties are so popular, but they also have collaborators, all of whom are the rights holders, the executors. So in the case of Gypsy, it's the Julie Stein estate, as well as Jerome Robbins' estate, as well as Arthur Laurents' estate, and Stephen Sondheim, who is still very much with us. And the same thing with West Side Story, except instead of Julie Stein's estate, it's the Leonard Bernstein estate. So those four rights holders in both cases have to, first of all, they have to do a lot of talk, a lot of communicating to one another, and a lot of agreeing on what the next step should be in any major production. In terms of the stock and amateur rights and all of the other productions, you know, some authors get very, very hands-on, but you can drive yourself crazy. You can't, I mean, as Arthur said to me before he died, and Jonathan, his agent, who is now my agent, both said to me, you don't want to spend your life policing approval over every single production of West Side Story or Gypsy that's done all around the world, because you'll never sleep. Because they're done constantly, and there's no need to. It's really just the major production contracts.
And you really have to then develop these relationships with the other estates or with the other authors, because and I'm sure that could be tricky at times as well. Like if you have one vision and they have another.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And you know, we together, we get along pretty well certainly on West Side Story, and we had decided a long time ago, even before Arthur passed away, that we wanted a unanimous decision. Certainly, if there was a proposal for some production that 2 out of the 4 estates were against, then it wouldn't pass. It is possible that if 3 out of the 4 parties want it to happen, then it could happen. But that's very rare. It usually, after much discussion sometimes, we all like to agree unanimously, because it just gives a better vote of confidence for the whole production that all the estates are behind it.
Now, do you, say, have to seek out opportunities? Do they usually come to you? Is it something that you're aware of? Oh, we should probably revive this show, or is it more, let's see what comes our way?
Well, that's different answers for different properties. I mean, certainly, we've never, ever had to go after people to revive West Side Story or Gypsy. You know, some of the other properties are more, you know, not as popular. So those will take a little more effort. You know, sometimes I will think of a director or a producer or a star that I think would be a fantastic asset to one of his properties and suggest it to the parties involved. But typically, I'm busy most of the time just with requests. But that's the nature of Arthur's, you know, shows. It's both a great privilege and a great responsibility that his shows are so popular. You know, which leads me in terms of the foundation, unlike most foundations that are left, you know, sometimes a family foundation or someone's money, you know, this is a foundation that continues to grow every year, the Laurents Hatcher Foundation, because we have a steady income stream that comes directly from all these productions of the big shows that Arthur wrote. Those royalties go right back into the foundation. So every year, our foundation has grown. So we have to, which is thrilling because it means we have to give out more money every year.
Right. We'll talk about that in a second, who might receive it. You know, actually, you mentioned Jonathan Loma because he mentioned this to me when we had a conversation early on. He was saying how really authors and writers, they're preservationists or they're sort of perpetualists. So either they want their word, the word on the page is the word on the page and don't ever change that word on the page, which is fine. Or they want to adapt to times. They want to keep things going. And at the DGCM, we have this conversation with people that might enroll with us. How do you want us to make these decisions? Is it what you wrote on the page, or do you want the council to think about it? So how do you think of Arthur? Like how was he, and then how does that impact all these decisions that you're making?
Well, one of the great luxuries I had, which not all executors of people, literary estates do have, is that luckily Arthur and I spoke about this for several years before he passed away. So I wanted to be completely as prepared as possible as I could for just what you're asking. So in answer to your question, for instance, with Gypsy and West Side Story, Arthur directed those last two revivals on Broadway before he passed in 2008 and 2009. And he wanted me to be his associate director, sitting beside him at the table every day of rehearsal. I mean, he wanted my support, but you know, he still had a tremendous energy. At 90 years old, he had more energy than most people in the room. But he wanted me to, and very carefully, we knew our goal here. Every scene, every page of dialogue, he would tell me what was important to him in this scene, and sometimes more importantly, what was not. So, you know, for instance, with West Side Story, he said, as long as the essentials of the story and the characters, and the story is driven through character, Arthur believed in that very strongly, that the best plot was driven by character. And so he wanted his characters to stay true, and therefore what the story was would stay true. However, he also said it could take place on the moon. And the jets could be blue people and the sharks could be green people. But as long as we understood the basics of the story, that the blue people had, you know, Arthur liked to say with each of his works, he could encapsulate what it was about in one sentence. And he said, I think every writer should be able to give that to a director to know what the show essentially is. So for instance, Gypsy, he said, Gypsy is, one sentence, the need for recognition. So everything in the production must help contribute to Rose and Louise's need for recognition. With West Side Story, it was the struggle to love in a world of bigotry and violence. So you needed that world of bigotry and violence and what caused that, and you need that love story. Both of those things to be equally important. So if it were set in the moon with blue people and green people, as long as we understood the racism and bigotry, because the blues hate green people and the greens hate blue people, and the social injustice of it all, that was what was critical to him. He wasn't such a stickler as he said, what's important to me is the cake, not all the frosting that's on the cake. So what most people don't realize, when we did the 2008 revival on Broadway, everyone, I guess you'd have to classify Arthur as the latter, because he felt that he wanted it to be, on 2008, he added a lot of Spanish because he wanted the Puerto Ricans to have Spanish. But what most people didn't recognize, because frankly, most people think they know West Side Story inside and out, What they know is the 1961 movie, which is not the show. And even the movie, the dialogue wasn't written by Arthur. The screenplay was by Ernest Lehman. And when, you know, people don't realize oftentimes that when a playwright sells his property to a movie studio, he is also selling, unless he's very, very powerful and has absolute control, which is very, very rare, and certainly not in 1961, when they sold the rights to the movie. The rights to the screenplay were given to the producers, so they could choose a screenwriter. Now, they could stay as faithful as they wanted, with as much, you know, advice from Arthur and the others as possible. But frankly, Arthur and even Leonard Bernstein and Stephen Sondheim did not have that much to do with the 1961 film. Once they sold the rights, they trusted that Robert Wise, the director, and at first Jerome Robbins as co-director, although then he was let go from the movie, that they would protect the work. But they had to trust that Ernest Lehman, who was the screenwriter that they chose, would aptly adapt Arthur's words. So it's two separate things. When you talk about the rights for a revival on stage, that's very different than when you're talking about the rights for a new movie. Mm-hmm. Or any movie.
I mean, when I mean, that's come up recently, right? So
yes.
We have this home. Was that something that you got to participate in then as the literary executor to approve the screenwriter on that?
Absolutely, very much so. You know, the movie of the one thing that Arthur did not like the movie of 1961. There were many things he didn't like about it, which he wrote about often, and he talked to me about a lot. But, you know, he felt a lot of it was sanitized and homogenized, and the obvious things of, at that time, 1961, you know, the sharks were not Latino, they were Latinx, they were all, you know, and had to put, even Rita Moreno had to put, you know, dark skin makeup on herself, even though she was full-blooded Puerto Rican, because the producers at the time thought she didn't look dark enough to be the Puerto Rican. So, and the Jets were all blonde, you know, bleached blonde hair, and, you know, and a lot of, but there were other things. A lot of it took place in bright sunny skies in Manhattan because Technicolor had just come in. And so they wanted to feature that. But, you know, Arthur's whole point was, I wrote a play that takes place at night. If you really know West Side Story, it takes place in 2 nights. And just first night and then the second night. There are no daytime scenes. He used to say, I wrote about rats in a gutter. These are kids who live in slums. They're poor and they've been reduced to violence. So and gang violence specifically. So, you know, there's lots of things that people can change. The one thing Arthur had said is, he said, promise me before I die, you will fight that I'm in favor of a new movie of West Side Story. But 2 things. One, you must insist on a cinematic genius to direct. It was interesting. One of Arthur's first things was, he said to me, I do not let them get a theater director who wants to a career in movies. Try
their hand on film, right?
No, because he said, you know, Arthur, what most people don't realize, Arthur had done just as many movies as plays. So he knew Hollywood and he knew that art form very well. And he said it's a different skill. And if they are going to do it again, West Side, I want them to do it right, which means they need to get the darkness of the vision, but they need a cinematic genius to direct. And then the second requirement was, please, 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 whoever adapts the screenplay, which he knew was going to happen, make sure that person is smart. Arthur was one of the smartest people I've ever known. And certainly other people in the business have attested that fact constantly. You know, he was a brilliant mind and he wanted that. So when the prospect of Steven Spielberg came up to direct this revival, I thought, well, you can't get any more cinematic genius than that. And I went out to LA and met with Spielberg, and we had what I thought would be like an hour interview turned into a 4-hour interview.
Wow.
And he wanted to know everything possible. He's a remarkable man because not only is he a genius, but he's very down to earth. He's very humble. And he's smart enough to know, as he said to me, I said to him at one point, look, I can go on talking about West Side Story for 12 hours, but you're Steven Spielberg. So just tell me to shut up whenever you want me to, because I know you're a genius and you're going to do what you're going to do. And he looked at me and he said, I want you to tell me every single word, because you are my link to those artists, especially to Arthur, and to what he meant by each of these scenes. So no, I want to hear everything. So that was a great introduction. And then when I talked about the screenwriter, he said, well, I was hoping to ask, you know, if it was all right, if it meets your approval, I was hoping to ask Tony Kushner. And of course I said, check, done, you know,
Okay.
smart. Well, I thought those, to me, in terms of my responsibility as the executor to go forward with this major new movie of West Side Story, those two had been amply met by Steven Spielberg and Tony Kushner. And then the next step was for me to work with Tony Kushner on the screenplay.
Oh, wow. Okay. I mean, I want to talk a little bit, and it might be easier to talk about in the context of the Broadway revival that just, it opened, but didn't get enough of a, it probably
Right.
closed before it had a chance to open, right?
Right.
You know, in terms of script changes and things like that, because I understand with the movie, okay, maybe because you're kind of turning it into a new media, it's sort of a different thing. But when you're talking about the script being put on the stage for another revival, now someone wants to make a change.
Yes.
You've been through that with
Many
the author
times.
holding
Many
your hand,
times.
but now what happens when the author's not there? Now you're making these changes.
Right.
Or you're approving them. So can you talk a little bit about that process? Like how do you go about saying, when do you say no? When do you say yes? Do you get involved in the nitty gritty? Do you, how does it work?
Absolutely. It depends on the artist involved. With this particular case, Scott Rudin was the lead producer. Scott knew Arthur very well for years. And that's how I knew Scott for years, through Arthur. So I knew Arthur was, that Scott was important. It was important to Scott to uphold Arthur's intentions and to do Arthur proud with the script. However, there were immediate things that they knew that Ivo van Hove, the director, wanted to do it in one act with no intermission, which meant he had to cut some things. So before they even came to me, they talked about cutting I Feel Pretty, the whole song, and they talked about cutting the Somewhere Ballet. Well, those are two different, I mean, the song, I Feel Pretty, is really Leonard Bernstein and Stephen Sondheim. It's their domain. Mm-hmm. So if they agreed to that, then I would agree. But it wasn't up to me to decide a song like I Feel Pretty, can you cut it? And it was up to Leonard Bernstein and Stephen Sondheim. Now, once they made that decision to cut that song, there were not a lot. I mean, one of the great assets of Arthur's work as a librettist to musicals is that he was so economical. His work is a lesson in economy. So leading into, in the original, I Feel Pretty begins Act 2 after intermission, and he had about a page and a half of dialogue, which led into the song. Well, if they're not going to do the song, then obviously they're not going to do that dialogue. And so this decision was sort of made for me, because I thought, well, I can't insist on them doing that page and a half of dialogue that leads into the song, because there's no point to that dialogue if they're not going to come to fruition in the song. So that was an easy decision. There were other, what I was going to say, I started to say earlier in the 2008 revival, what people didn't notice is that more than the Spanish, what was different was Arthur went through the script with me line by line, and we cut a lot of dialogue that was considered dated. And the reason it was considered dated was not so much that the essence or the story had changed, because it hasn't. Unfortunately, it's still as universal as possible. But there were some things like say uncle, or oubliou, and you can punctuate it with an oo, and things like that, that Arthur just took a pencil and said, let's get rid of it, let's get rid of it, let's get rid of it. Because as he said, one of the reasons I had that sort of lightness in the script was because of the time. Don't forget, in 1957, when West Side Story premiered, Broadway musical theater didn't have people dying, your lead characters dying left and right on stage or being killed. So he needed to soften that blow a bit and make it a little more palatable for the audiences of the time by adding some of that, as he called it, this ooblioo, ooh, and punctuated straight out of Guys and Dolls. He said, this stuff is not, you know, this stuff is stuff I did to temper the blow. But now, in 2008, the world has changed and the world of theater has changed. So people are so much more used to that. You don't need to sugarcoat it. You don't need to do things like that to make the blow less intense. So he cut a lot of that stuff. It's interesting because when you mentioned that the current revival, which you know, I hope will come back after this this pandemic is over, that they came to me and said, look, we'd like to cut some of the lines. And I looked at the script and I said, what script are you using?
Oh,
because
wow.
Arthur had cut those lines in 2008. So this line, that line, that line, that line, a lot of the requests you're making were already done by Arthur himself in 2008. So that made it very easy for me. There were other instances where it didn't come up. For instance, we didn't cut I Feel Pretty. We didn't cut the ballet. And the ballet also fell more under Bernstein and Robbins. Now, this current revival had already made the decision and worked out the deal with Robbins that they weren't going to use the Robbins choreography. So that changed things. However, it was still a big concern for the Bernsteins, who had to decide how much of that music do we want in the show, even though there is no ballet.
Wow. Were there any times when there was a script change where you had to, and maybe this happened more in the 2008 version, where you got to push back and say, can I change this?
There were, particularly in 2008, when it was actually 2008 was Gypsy, 2009 was West Side, and then 2010 through 2014 was when I did the national tour that went on for several years. And there were and I was directing that. Arthur said to me, listen, now you go and direct the national tour because I'm exhausted. And so I did. And there were certain things in certain scenes I said, listen, Arthur, I'd like to try this without this line, or I'd like to try doing this number a little differently. And because he trusted me as a director, because I had directed so many of his works, this is why this relationship, you see, works so well, was that he had trust in me as a director. So he said, fine. Now, there were other examples between then and the current revival. One particular, I'll give you an example of an estate and how executors have to get involved, and sometimes it's not easy, and sometimes you don't win. There was a production in a opera festival in Europe about 4 or 5 years ago. And they, the diva who played Maria was 50 years old. So they wanted to use a reflection of herself as young Maria. So there'd be a young acting Maria and then the older diva be singing Maria. Well, it was a, you know, so concept, but we all allowed it, saying it's an opera festival, it's only going to be 4 weeks, and operas are used to that. However, then we got wind that they were making other changes, including, and this is very much what I'm talking about when you talk about the essence of an author's story, as opposed to maybe just the dialogue. They set up the two Marias in the overture, in the music, there was no new dialogue, but they just had a dumb show where they saw Maria apparently now own the bridal shop, you know, 30 years later, after Tony's death, and she saw herself as a young girl in the mirror at the before the whole play began. So they set up that conceit right at the beginning. But what was more disturbing was, and I got wind of this from people I knew in the opera world, who went to a first preview and said, you do realize that at the end of the play, they are having, during the final scene, after Maria, mourns Tony's death, she then goes, because it's 30 years later, and jumps off the front of the stage into a moving train, a subway train, and kills herself.
Oh, okay.
And this is all done to just music. The music already exists. There was no new dialogue written. She screams, jumps in front of the train, and then the last image was seeing her rejoin Tony up in heaven, or supposed heaven, up on a platform up above the stage. That's changing the essence of the story. And I got very upset, and I said, no, this is an example. As executor of his literary estate, I have to step forward and protect his work and say that is not what Arthur wrote. Arthur would never, ever have approved that. In fact, I even had a story I related to them during the Broadway run. We had a talk back with audiences. And one woman said to Arthur, Mr. Laurents, why did you choose to not have Maria kill herself as Juliet does in Shakespeare's play? And Arthur's response was, because this isn't Shakespeare's play. I based it on his play, but I wrote my own characters in the 1950s. And as working on the script, I discovered and found that Maria was a very strong young woman who was stronger than Tony, who actually was the strength in the play, and that she was a survivor, and she would survive no matter what. And then the woman said, that's very interesting. Can I ask you, what do you think happened to Maria after the curtain came down? And Arthur looked at her and said, there is no after, the curtain comes down. And that was typical Arthur. He said, I'm not in the business of writing sequels.
Right.
I'm not writing a sequel to West Side Story. At the end of West Side Story, Maria finds Tony dead, gives her impassioned speech about what she's learned, that I can kill now because I hate now, and yet she chooses to drop the gun, and she chooses to reach out to a shark for help. That's the end of the story.
That's the end. So we won't be seeing a sequel anytime soon.
No. However, that example of that European festival, so all the other rights holders, Stephen Sondheim, first one to agree, said, no, that's not allowable, that's absurd, we must stop this. So we tried to stop it. We sent letters, we had edge, and they didn't stop it. Now the run only ran, 4 more weeks, and what we were told was that in Europe, in specific circumstances, in specific countries, and this was in Salzburg, it was the director is given a lot more creative freedom. And this is an opera festival where they're used to dealing with librettists who have been dead 200, 300 years. The biggest difference is that there was not a copyright on those works, because even on West Side Story, the rule for copyrights is, and there'll be no more need for us to get involved with future productions of West Side Story, after it's 75 years after the last creative writer or contributor. So the 4 of them is dead. So it will be 75 years after Stephen Sondheim's death that the rights will go into public domain.
Right. I mean, this is so interesting. I mean, this is the stuff we deal with all the time at the Guild, and those that choose to maintain relationships with us, memberships with us, as an estate memberships, certainly things that we help people with all the time. I mean, you said so much. It's hard. Can we pin down, like, what are some good traits that somebody really needs to have here? Because it sounds like you were like the saint, right? You had directed, you had this relationship, you pushed back and forth, you kind of knew. So and you have to know the business side, you have to be awake enough to kind of see what's going on. I mean, what are these?
It was an ideal relationship to build into the next step, which is to become the protector of these properties. Mm-hmm. And I realized a lot of people don't have it. Even myself now, when this all happened and I had to write my own will, in my will, I had to leave instructions as to who would then become the executor of this estate on my passing, and who would become the head of the foundation on my passing. these are two big responsibilities. And many times I often say every day, I'm so thankful to Arthur. You'll see behind me, actually, there's a poster on the wall. I don't know if you can see it, but it's a picture of Arthur and a little actually blurb that underneath it written by Scott Rudin that was in Vanity Fair magazine when Arthur's biography, original story by, first came out. And so, you know, I had this long relationship with Arthur, and what he left me was an incredible privilege, and I thank him every day. I also curse him, not every day, but occasionally, because it's a tremendous amount of responsibility as well as a tremendous privilege. And you have to be able to embrace both of those things.
Is there something you wish you knew, before this? I'm sure you've learned a lot over the course of years.
I learned so much, thankfully, because Arthur and I talked about it. If there's a writer out there that is thinking of someone they would love to leave their literary estate to, the biggest thing I would advise them is talk about it with the individual. Talk about what you want for your legacy, how you want your work to be protected, and what's important in the work. So that, because some people, as you said, some people don't want, Jonathan also represents Edward Albee. And, Edward had a much more hands-on, strict handling of his works while he was alive. He wanted to approve every single cast member of every single production done around the country, which was really time-consuming, but that's what he wanted. Now that he's gone, it's a different thing for the executors. And so I would advise as much talk as possible between a potential executor and the writer. Because the more knowledge you're given, there are many things that for instance, a new movie of West Side Story, a new movie of Gypsy. Arthur was still alive when producers in Hollywood wanted to do a new movie of Gypsy, and he met and I met, and and Barbra Streisand was interested in doing it. And one thing Arthur said was, I will allow Barbara, now this was 15 years ago, when it started the conversations, I would allow Barbara to play the role, but she cannot direct and play the role. And of course, after Arthur died, Barbra Streisand wanted to direct it. And it was easy for me to say, it doesn't matter what I think, because she gave me a lot of arguments as to why she'd be a good director for it. And I said, I can hear those things, but unfortunately, Arthur had already laid it down in writing that he did not approve of that. So that was an easy decision for me. I'm saying my job here is to uphold Arthur's wishes. However, as the years go by, there are many new things that come up all the time. And I just have to rely on my knowledge of Arthur, of what made him tick, of his personal aesthetic, what he wished for the pieces, and even in some cases, what he thought of certain directors or writers. And thankfully, everything I know helps arm me to make a decision that I believe in my conscience is the one Arthur would have made.
I have so many more questions for you.
Yes,
I could go on forever, but there's a couple from the participants, so I want to make sure that okay. they get access to you too. I won't hog you for just for myself. So I think Kristen, do you want to have them ask a couple, and then maybe I could get mine back in. I don't know.
Okay. So someone wants to know, David, do you as literary executor get paid? And if so, how was that determined?
That is, again, something that is case by case. I think it's usually done in some working out with the, in this case, it's the agent that represents Arthur's work. And when Arthur died and when this whole transition happened, typically a literary executor will get some kind of a percentage of royalty, and it's usually very small. I mean, you know, she asked me if I knew before what, you know what I would have asked? I would have asked for more money. I would have asked for more money, yeah, because, or a bigger percentage, because it's a lot of work. Between the executorship and the foundation, I probably spend 40 hours a week on those things. And I have my own career. So it's a lot of work. I do get a small percentage of Arthur's royalties.
Okay, if you want to ask someone to be your literary executor, but they're in the same generation or age bracket as you, is it also your responsibility to come up with a backup literary executor? And how big of a consideration should be your literary executor's age in relation to your own?
That's a tough question. I think if you are young, it's not a problem. I think if you're older, you know, Arthur, when he appointed me and talked to me about this, he was in his 80s. And so he very consciously wanted someone much younger, because obviously you don't want to, you know, so it depends on the person involved. If a person's older and a playwright wants to pick a literary executor, and you happen to be, you know, 75 or older or 70 or older, I would think it's probably smartest not to pick someone in your same age bracket, because you want someone younger, because first of all, it's a lot of work. So you need someone who's still got vigor and stamina. And also you want, hopefully, that person to live on for quite a bit after you, so that you're not constantly having to change hands.
Okay. Can an executor reassign the position to someone else? And if so, how does that work?
Yes, that's a good question. I think that you can, in most cases, well, certainly in my case, it's because I want to represent Arthur as long as I can, as long as I'm able mentally and physically to do a good job. If for some reason I was becoming incapacitated, I would want someone else to take over, which is why, as I said earlier, I've already put someone in my will. Now I can change my will at any time, because I'm constantly looking for who would be the best person to take over this position.
Now, are you going to actively train that person in the same way?
That's a good question too. I guess that would probably be the best thing. I mean, at this point, Arthur's only been gone 9 years. He died May 5th, 9 years ago, May 5th. So, you know, I've learned and been doing so much, but I would think sometime in the next 10 years, I would like to identify that person and start to share with them what I've learned and what I know about Arthur's work.
Okay. Let's see. What, if anything, do you do to promote Laurents's lesser known works? Are there plays he particularly hoped would get more attention?
Yes, sometimes, you know, there was a play he wrote that he was very fond of because he felt it was ahead of its time, about an outsider, a gay man. You know, Arthur always wrote about social injustice, and he wrote about the outsider. Whether, you know, he said, you know, the Katie Hubble in The Way We Were is really Arthur, a young Jewish, you know, political activist who finds her handsome, beautiful, wasp blonde boy and falls in love, as Arthur did with his partner, Tom Hatcher. And he wrote that movie for Barbara. So he wrote a play called The Enclave, and it didn't get much of a run. It was a little off-Broadway production. I think it was ahead of its time. And there was a production, I talked to these people down at the Rattlestick Theater Company, small theater down in Lower Manhattan. And they did a production of it a year or two ago, and I was so happy. And actually the foundation gave them some support, some financial support for that production, because it was important to me that that work get seen. And they had a really interesting idea for it. They wanted to use trans actors in the production. so that the level of being an outsider wasn't just about the story that Arthur wrote at the time, but it also was reflected in the knowledge that even some of the women in the show were being played by trans actors. Or vice versa, the men. So it was a fascinating example. I do think, I know for his anniversary, for his centennial, for his 100th anniversary of his birth, in 2007, I put together a program where we offered theaters around the country, we would give them a $50,000 grant towards a production of one of Arthur's lesser known works, not a musical, but the plays that he had done that might not be done that frequently. And so I tried to encourage productions of those lesser known plays that way.
I think we're about ready to wrap it up.
I could go on for hours.
Yeah. I know. I don't want to take too much of your time. Do you want to ask one more question?
Yeah, just one more. Because a couple people were kind of asking about this. What are the pros and cons of making your agent your literary executor?
Well, don't forget, it wasn't my agent. It was Arthur's agent. He happened to, just shortly before Arthur died, my agent retired. And I asked Arthur's agent, Jonathan, if he would be interested in representing me as a director. This was a few years before Arthur died. And he said, yes, I'd love to. So he then became my agent as well. But the question you asked, it's not like sometimes, a literary executor has an agent that didn't know the writer in question at all. So it's a little more difficult decision. But I think that decision is going to be primarily based, that's a business decision. And you want to make sure that, I'll give you an example. There are many times where people came forward to Arthur and wanted revivals of some of his shows done on Broadway, and they didn't have a strong concept as to what they were going to do with it. Why revive it, other than money? And I remember I was at one of these meetings with a couple of big producers on Broadway who said to Arthur said, you haven't given me any reason to revive this. And they said, Arthur, you'll make a lot of money. And that's when Arthur said, you don't know me. I have plenty of money to last me for my life. I don't care about money. That's not the prime motivator in me making a decision. So if your writer is like that, you want to make sure that the agent who handles those decisions respects that money is not the be all and end all. You don't want a thing done just because it's going to make money. You have to think about preserving the sanctity of the work. If you do a production that is, it can be different, but if it's bad, if it's just a really bad, production clearly just to cash in and make a lot of money, you're damaging the future reputation of that work. You're damaging the licensing of that work, which in Arthur's case, with West Side Story and Gypsy, certainly, those licenses that go on year after year around the world are what keeps the work going and what keeps, in all honesty, his foundation growing, because the foundation gets those royalties.
I just want to make one clarification. I'm seeing a lot in the chat about the copyright. So generally speaking, it's life plus 70 years. And if you have questions about that, you can always write into the help desk and we'll help you figure out the copyright on that. So don't get confused.
Yeah. I remember with a production, when there's something that has more than one writer. I mean, for instance, most musicals. I do know that if it's 70 or 75, if it's 70 years, it's from the death of the final living. So it's not from the death, Leonard Bernstein died first. It's not 70 years from his death. It's 70 years from, and then Robbins, and then Arthur, and now Steve. So it will be 70 years from Steve's death before the work enters public domain.
Musical, right? If anyone's confused about this, please feel free to write in to us and we'll walk you through it. I just wanted to ask my last question, which was, really, I just wanted to know how you would hope he would be remembered as a person, as someone, as we talk about him now. You know, we talk about his works, but the man himself, you know, what can we hold with us?
Well, that's a very personal question. For me personally, I would hope that, and I think many people who are alive still that knew him very well would attest to this. First of all, he was, as I've mentioned, perhaps the smartest man in the theater I've ever known. His intellect was second to none. You know, the artists that would call him for advice on their works is endless. You know, I remember being around when Stephen Schwartz and Winnie Holtzman came out to Quogue for the weekend to spend with Arthur because they were developing Wicked and they wanted his advice. And, you know, Stephen Sondheim always went to him for advice. You know, the dinners meant, you know, once every few weeks he would have dinner with Mike Nichols. Mike Nichols was another incredibly smart man. So I would say Arthur's fierce intellect was matched only by his fierce passion for fighting for social causes. He was a complete advocate in fighting for theater and for gay causes. Those were his two biggest causes. But he hated injustice of any kind, social injustice. And that was so important to him. And it's reflected in a lot of his work as well.
And probably a lot of the work that you do at the foundation as well to keep that in mind as well.
Absolutely.
Very great. All right, David, thank you. I don't want to take up more of your time. We have questions coming in.
I know. I don't know how to read on this because I'm on my iPhone. There's a lot of, as we've been speaking, I've been getting a lot of I don't know what you call them, messages from people. And I'm not sure where to read those, but I would like to read them. I haven't had time because I was too busy answering all of your questions.
If you're willing to stick around for more questions, we're
sure.
Okay, great.
Okay, cool. Let me just scroll up a little bit. Okay, so you touched on this a little bit already, but can you talk more about the best way the relationship between the executor, the agent, and the publisher should work?
The publisher. Well, you know, the publisher usually, in most cases, the publisher has already published the works hopefully before the artist has died. In our case, there was one. You know, Arthur had written a couple of plays. I did a lot of his new plays at George Street, and he wrote a couple of plays that have not been produced yet at all. They haven't even, one of them wasn't even finished. And then he wrote, his last book was called The Rest of the Story, which was a follow-up to his autobiography, the original story by. And he finished that the week before he died, but he asked me to edit it, and then I had to deal with the publishers and edit that book. So that was I dealt with my agent, Jonathan, who knew Arthur so well, to help me with all those, you know, hurdles to jump through.
Okay. It actually looks like everything else has been answered. The rest are just thank yous for doing this.
I saw some names flashing across the bottom of my phone who I knew. I'd love to get some, if there's a way for me to see those names.
Yeah. I can definitely send those over to you.
Oh, I just pushed on something called chat, and now I'm seeing. Oh yeah, see, Stephen Dietz, yeah. Lyle Kessler, yeah. Okay. Oh, this is interesting.
Get you the list of everyone that attended.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you so much. I hope this was helpful. And then, do you store this, or how is this? Is go in your archives, or how does this work?
Yeah. So it'll go both on the Guild's website and also on the DGCM's website. So we should have that up fairly quickly on the DGCM's website. So it'll be available for anyone who missed it to view. And of course, if they have any other questions, they can always email us.
Great. And one of the things that I didn't talk about much was what the foundation actually does. But
you can if you'd like to. I wanted to one on my my list.
Yeah,
of long
I know. I'm sorry. There's so much. As I told you, if Steven Spielberg, the conversation went on for 4 hours, then you know, and that was just about West Side Story. The foundation, I actually asked Arthur to talk to me about the foundation before he died. Even though I was in no rush for him to die, I said, look, why not start? Because he knew one of the things he wanted from the foundation was to every year give an award to a play by an emerging writer, not a musical, but a play. And as his reasoning was, he said, everybody wants to fund new musicals because they think and know that's their route to possibly making a lot of money. But nobody wants to fund new plays because it's very rare that a play makes a lot of money. So he said, I want to help playwrights, young or emerging playwrights. It doesn't have to necessarily be by age. It doesn't have to be somebody in their early 20s or something. But if somebody's an emerging writer, they could be 40 or older. It doesn't matter. But an emerging writer hasn't had much work done at all. If they've written a world premiere, a play, and Arthur said to me, okay, so, David, the Pulitzer Prize is you get a certificate for your wall or a plaque and you get $10,000. And I was shocked. I said, the Pulitzer Prize gives you only $10,000? He said, that's right. So he said, I want it to be, what would make, now you've got to remember this was 10 years ago, or 11 years ago, he asked me what would make a difference in an emerging writer's life. What I would like is the monetary award to be sufficient enough so that for a year, they didn't have to tend bar or be a waiter or be a, whatever, that they could, a survival job, that they could afford to just write for a year. And I said, okay, $50,000. And he said, okay, then that's what it'll be. And then typical Arthur, he said, more important than living for a year is for a young writer is to get their work done, produced. So what would entice a nonprofit, not a commercial, a nonprofit theater from doing a new play? And since I've run a nonprofit theater for 23 years, I said, $100,000. So he said, okay, then the award will be $150,000. $50,000 will go directly to the writer and as a check just to spend on however they want to keep themselves afloat, pay the rent, whatever. And $100,000 would go directly to direct production costs in that theater doing their play. And that's what that award became. And we've now given out that award for 9-10 years because I asked Arthur to start. I said, before you're gone, let's start so we get the feeling of it. So we put together a board panel and then we selected a group of panelists of readers of different writers and directors and producers and agents and actors. And we wrote out to theaters around the country that had a history of producing new work. Now, as running a theater, I can tell you, a lot of theaters, the development departments will apply for every grant because they say, oh, we do new work. What they mean is they do readings of new work or they do workshops of new work. That doesn't mean they're going to produce it on their main stage. And that was what was important to Arthur. So we made sure that the theaters we asked, you were only invited to submit plays. And it had to be an unproduced work, not a musical. And it had to be a shorter production in a theater that was used to producing new plays, and that the $100,000 couldn't be more than 50% of what the production cost the theater to produce. So that gave us some guidelines, and we got that going. We did it, and then the board and Arthur and I read the finalists. We narrowed it down. There were about 100 submissions. We narrowed it down to 10 plays, and we all read the 10 plays. And then we all agreed on the one that should be the winner. And then that's what we've done every year. And we also have a proviso in our guidelines that, you know, they do come in cycles. So in some years you get 3 or 4 great new plays, and you think unanimously we all want to fund these plays, and it's very tough for us to choose one. There are other years, there was one year in particular where there was no one play that any of us thought, that's a great new play. And so we just didn't give the award that year.
Oh, wow.
But usually we have, and more, you know, only one year have we not given the award. And then, but then after Arthur's death, all of his assets transferred to the foundation. So suddenly the foundation, you know, before, you know, giving away $150,000 annually in this award, plus some other bequests he had left in his will, took care of the taxes that you need to get divest. Suddenly the foundation jumped. So suddenly we needed a lot more. So we decided, this is after Arthur's death now. So I started with my board to come up with guidelines of how every year we would accept proposals from theaters around the country that weren't necessarily an emerging writer, but a world premiere production of a play that they were seeking support for. So, you know, whether it be Lynn Nottage or, you know, there were many writers that we loved and we wanted to support, but they were hardly emerging writers. So that covered that. And now we give out, you know, over $1 million a year from the foundation in these. And what typically it is a $50,000 grant. And I'll give you another example. Acting in Arthur's spirit. Arthur he opened every piece of mail on his desk immediately and answered every letter immediately. You never saw a pile on his desk. He said, why wait? Take care of it now. And so if there was an actor in the production that he thought wasn't working out and he wanted to let go, and he would talk to me about it, and I'd say, well, do you want to give him a week or so? And he'd say, why wait? We know it's the right decision, but do it now. That's the way Arthur worked. So when this happened and Broadway closed and COVID happened and Broadway closed, and then also the all these regional theaters closed, George Street closed. We had a new play called Conscience that had to shut down. And we had another play coming up that couldn't go into rehearsal. Suddenly I was reeling, we were all reeling. And I felt like most of us impotent. You know, we all felt like we can't control this damn disease, and how can we help? And then it suddenly occurred to me, wait a minute, I run a foundation. And so that night, we closed on Thursday. That night, Thursday night, I called the board and I said, I would like to give. We still have an amount to give out to catch up of our giving out, because we had made a lot of money with other things like the Broadway and the movie of West Side. So we had more money to give out. I said, I would like to propose that we give sight unseen, give grants to the theaters that we have been consistently funding with proposals for new productions over the past 9-10 years, and just send them, no strings attached, $25,000 each, because we had about $700,000 that we could give out. So I said, let's do it, and let's do it right now. So the next day, Friday, we literally sent emails to almost 30 regional theaters around the country and said, we want to just say, as a gesture of support, there's help here, and we're going to jump right in and say, here's $25,000. Use it to help you get through this difficult time. And also, what I was hoping, which turned out to be true, a lot of artistic directors from around the country would write me and say, I was so moved by your gesture, but also I want to ask you, could I use this could I send your letter and your action to other foundations as an example to show, so maybe other foundations will take the example, and if they're in the position to give more money to help this emergency situation. I said, of course. That's why I wanted to do it so quickly. So that made me feel really good, because it made me feel like, you know what? I'm doing something that that would help right now.
Yeah, I was going to ask you what you're thinking now. You know, what is sort of your hopes and thoughts as you're reflecting, and that just sort of.
Yeah.
does give a lot of hope and help for people that need it, you know.
And, you know, that was something, you know, Arthur, you know, people knew Arthur as this difficult person, or could be a difficult person. He wasn't, and for me, and he was incredibly generous, and that people don't remember, or they don't talk about. You know, when I was running George Street, I have been running George Street, but when Arthur was alive, you know, sometimes we would talk almost every day. And after a end of the year budget meeting with my board, which every head of a theater knows that this is like, and when you're looking at a deficit and you say, oh my God, you know, what are we going to do? We have another deficit this year. How are we going to handle it? And I would call Arthur, and I wouldn't even say anything. He'd say, what's wrong? I can hear it in your voice. And I'd say, well, I just got out of our end of the year budget meeting, and we're facing a deficit again, and I just can't bear this. And he would say, how much is your deficit? And I'd say, 150,000. He'd say, the check is in the mail.
Oh, wow. Just
like that. He would put a check in the mail, and 2 days later, we would have that deficit taken care of. So he was incredibly generous to people or causes that he believed in. And luckily, he believed in George Street. You know, he called it his
theater there, right? Under his name, am I right?
Yes, the Arthur Laurents. We have a brand new building which just opened, and there are two theaters, and one of the theaters is named the Arthur Laurents Theater in his memory.
Very good. So I hope we'll all be able to buy tickets soon and come see.
I hope so. We all had to figure out. You know, I keep saying to my staff, you know, everybody is daunted and dismayed by this, but let's not forget, we are the most imaginative thinkers in the country, because artists are constantly having to improvise and to come up with creative ideas to get through an obstacle or to meet a challenge and to overcome it. And so I keep telling my staff, come on, let's use our creativity and come up with new, exciting, innovative ways to keep theater going.
I love it. Well, we're going to be watching you. We'll all be watching for your lead on that.
Thank you. Well, it was so great to talk to you all.
Thank you so much, and we really appreciate it.
And also, you know, I'm a big fan and friend of Andrew Lippa, who also worked with Arthur, and Andrew and I are working together on a new musical based on one of Arthur's properties.
Are you? Oh boy. Okay, now you've put a teaser out there. Okay.
Okay.
Well, we're all gonna watch that one.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Be well, and let's keep in touch. Hopefully, we'll get to talk to you again soon.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Take care, David.
Bye.